A millionaire takes homeless twins into his house, but his mother is shocked when she looks at the girls and discovers who they really are. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like so I can continue bringing more wonderful stories like this one. Your support is very important. The late autumn wind cut through Richard Harrison's expensive coat as he walked down Fifth Avenue, his mind elsewhere despite the bustle of New York City around him. The successful real estate developer had just left another tedious business meeting, preferring to walk the final blocks home rather than take his waiting car. These quiet moments were rare in his life, moments when he could just be anonymous among the crowds. A sudden movement caught his eye, two small figures huddled in a doorway, barely visible in the gathering dusk. He might have walked past, like the hundreds of others who hurried by, but something made him slow his steps. They were young girls, identical twins by the look of them, wearing tattered clothes that offered little protection against the bitter cold. Their dark hair was tangled and dirty, their faces smudged, but it was their eyes that stopped him completely. Large, haunted eyes that seemed to hold more pain than any child should know. The girls shrank back as he approached, pressed against each other protectively. They couldn't have been more than 12 years old. One clutched a worn backpack to her chest while the other positioned herself slightly in front, as if ready to defend her sister if necessary. The sight stirred something deep in Richard's chest. "Are you hungry?" he asked softly, keeping his distance so as not to frighten them further. The sisters exchanged a quick glance but remained silent. Richard could see them trembling, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "My name is Richard. I live just a few blocks from here. I could give you a hot meal, a safe place to warm up." The girl in front, he would later learn her name was Emily, studied him with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. Her sister Grace peered around her shoulder, hope and wariness warring in her expression. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help us?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard considered his answer carefully. "Because no one should have to sleep in doorways, especially not children. Because I have more than enough, and sharing costs me nothing." He paused, then added, "And because you remind me of someone, though I can't quite say who." After another silent exchange between the sisters, Emily gave a slight nod. They gathered their meager belongings, just the one backpack between them, and followed Richard at a careful distance. As they walked, he noticed how they moved in perfect synchronization, always aware of each other's position, as if they'd spent years protecting one another. The girl's eyes widened as they approached his brownstone in the Upper West Side, but they showed no other reaction. Inside, the warmth enveloped them, and Richard could see their shoulders relax fractionally. His housekeeper, Martha, appeared in the foyer, her eyebrows rising at the sight of the bedraggled children. "Martha, could you please prepare some hot soup and sandwiches?" Richard asked, "and perhaps find some clean clothes." Martha nodded, though he caught the concerned look she shot him before disappearing toward the kitchen. As the girls ate, carefully at first, then with increasing urgency as their hunger took over, Richard watched them from across the kitchen table. There was something hauntingly familiar about their features, something that tugged at his memory without quite surfacing. The way Grace tucked her hair behind her ear, the slight furrow in Emily's brow, these gestures seemed to echo something from his past. Upstairs, his elderly mother Eleanor was likely in her usual spot by the window, unaware of the visitors below. She rarely left her room these days, consumed by memories and regrets she refused to share. Richard wondered how she would react to the presence of children in the house. It had been just the two of them, along with Martha, for so long. Emily finished her soup first and fixed Richard with that penetrating stare again. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice stronger now that she had food in her stomach. Before he could answer, a sound from upstairs made all of them look up, the tap of a cane on hardwood floors. "Richard, who's down there with you?" Eleanor's voice drifted down, followed by slow footsteps on the stairs. Richard saw the girls tense, ready to bolt if necessary. But it was his mother's reaction when she entered the kitchen that shocked him to his core. Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks, her face draining of color as she stared at the twins. The cane slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. "It's not possible," she whispered, reaching out to steady herself against the doorframe. "They look just like—" Her voice trailed off as she swayed dangerously. Richard jumped up to support her, but his mind was racing. He had never seen his mother react this way to anything or anyone. The twins were now standing as well, pressed together, their eyes darting between Richard and Eleanor. There was fear in their expressions, yes, but also something else, recognition. But how could that be? They had never met his mother before. Eleanor's next words sent a chill down Richard's spine. Charlotte's girls. They have to be Charlotte's girls. Richard felt the world tilt slightly. Charlotte, a name he hadn't heard spoken in this house for years, but who was she? And why did his mother seem to recognize these children who had been living on the streets? As he looked between the twins and his mother, he could feel the weight of secrets, long buried, beginning to surface, threatening to change everything he thought he knew about his family. Eleanor's revelation hung in the air like a physical presence, making the kitchen feel smaller, more confined. Richard helped his mother to a chair, his mind racing. The twins remained frozen in place, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Was it hope? But Eleanor wasn't finished. As soon as she was seated, she reached out toward the girls with trembling hands. "Your eyes," she whispered, "they're exactly like hers. How did you find us? Did she send you?" Her voice cracked on the last question, heavy with emotion. Emily stepped forward slightly, still keeping her sister behind her. "We don't know anyone named Charlotte," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "We've been on our own for a long time." Richard studied the girls more carefully now, seeing what his mother had noticed immediately. There was something in their features, in the way they carried themselves, that spoke of a connection he couldn't yet understand. But Charlotte, the name stirred something in his memory, a half-forgotten conversation perhaps, or a glimpse of a photograph tucked away in a drawer. Martha, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern, stepped forward. "Mrs. Harrison, you're not well. Perhaps you should rest." But Eleanor waved her away impatiently. "How old are you?" she demanded, her eyes never leaving the twins' faces. 12, Grace answered softly, speaking for the first time since Eleanor had appeared. "We'll be 13 next month." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, and Richard saw tears forming in her eyes. "The timing, it fits perfectly," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Then she turned to Richard, her expression urgent. "They need to stay here. We can't let them leave." The twins exchanged alarmed glances, but before they could respond, Richard held up a hand. "Mother, you're frightening them. They're not prisoners. They're guests who need our help." He turned to Emily and Grace. "No one will force you to do anything, but it's getting late and it's cold outside. Would you consider staying just for tonight?" After another silent conversation conducted entirely through looks, Emily nodded slowly. "One night," she agreed, though her tone suggested she was already planning their escape if necessary. Martha led the girls upstairs to one of the guest rooms, leaving Richard alone with his mother. As soon as they were out of earshot, he turned to her. "Who is Charlotte, Mother? Why did seeing these girls affect you so strongly?" Eleanor's face closed off, the moment of emotional vulnerability passing. "It's late, Richard. I'm tired." She struggled to her feet, refusing his help. "Just keep them safe. Promise me that." Richard watched her make her way slowly up the stairs, leaning heavily on her cane. His mother had always been a reserved woman, especially after his father's death 5 years ago, but this was different. She knew something about these girls, about this mysterious Charlotte, and she was choosing to keep it hidden. That night, Richard found himself unable to sleep, his thoughts churning with questions. He could hear soft movement from the guest room where the twins were staying, suggesting they too were having trouble settling. Around midnight, he heard their door open quietly, followed by careful footsteps in the hallway. Moving silently, Richard stepped out of his room. Emily and Grace were creeping down the stairs, their backpack between them. They froze when they saw him, but instead of trying to stop them, he simply said, "The kitchen's stocked with food, if you'd like to take some with you." The unexpected offer seemed to throw them off balance. After a moment, Emily spoke. "Why are you being so kind to us?" "Because someone should be," Richard replied simply. "And because I think you're connected to this house somehow, even if I don't understand how yet." Grace tugged at her sister's sleeve. Maybe." She didn't finish the thought, but Emily seemed to understand. They shared another of their silent exchanges before Emily turned back to Richard. "Your mother," she said hesitantly. "She said we look like someone named Charlotte. Who is she?" Richard shook his head. "I wish I knew. But my mother's reaction to you was the most emotion I've seen from her in years. She's been lost, I suppose you could say, since my father died. Today was different." The girls absorbed this information, and Richard could almost see them weighing their options. Finally, Emily spoke again. "If we stay, we're not prisoners. We can leave whenever we want." "Absolutely," Richard assured them. "This isn't a trap. It's just an offer of help, food, shelter, safety. Nothing more unless you want it to be." The twins retreated a few steps, conferring in whispers. Richard waited patiently, knowing this moment would define whatever came next. When they turned back, Grace was clutching her sister's hand tightly. "We'll stay," Emily announced, "for now. But we have conditions." Richard nodded, encouraging her to continue. "We don't want to be separated. We need to be able to come and go freely, and—" She hesitated, then lifted her chin defiantly. "We want to know who Charlotte is. The truth, not more secrets." "That seems fair," Richard agreed. "Though I may need some time to uncover the truth myself. Will you help me look?" The girls exchanged glances again before nodding. As they turned to go back upstairs, Grace paused. "Thank you," she whispered. So quietly, Richard almost missed it. Then they were gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. The next morning brought new complications. Martha cornered Richard in his study before the twins were awake, her expression grave. "Mr. Harrison, I've worked for this family for 30 years. I remember Charlotte." Richard leaned forward eagerly, but Martha held up a hand to stop him. "It's not my place to tell that story, but you need to be careful. There are things about this family's past that were buried for a reason. These girls are children, Martha. They need help." "Yes, they do," Martha agreed, "but helping them might uncover things that can't be put back once they're revealed. Are you prepared for that?" Before Richard could respond, a scream echoed through the house. Eleanor's voice filled with terror. Richard bolted from his study, taking the stairs two at a time, Martha close behind him. They found Eleanor in her room, standing by her dresser, holding what appeared to be an old photograph in shaking hands. The twins appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. When Eleanor saw them, she thrust the photograph behind her back, but not before Richard caught a glimpse of a young woman with dark hair and a familiar smile. "Mother," he said firmly, "I think it's time you told me the truth about Charlotte." Eleanor sank into her chair, still clutching the hidden photograph. Her face was ashen as she looked between Richard and the twins. Finally, she whispered, "There are some truths that can destroy a family. This family is already haunted by secrets," Richard countered. "Look at what they're doing to you, to all of us." Eleanor closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. When she opened them again, her gaze fixed on the twins with an intensity that made them step back. "Your mother," she began, her voice breaking, "she worked in this house many years ago, and what happened to her, what we did to her, it was unforgivable." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the weight of Eleanor's words settled over them. Richard felt his heart racing as he looked at the twins, seeing them with new eyes. Who were they really? And what had his family done that was so terrible it had haunted his mother all these years? Before Eleanor could continue, however, Martha burst into the room, her face pale. "Mr. Harrison, there's someone at the door. They're asking about the girls, saying they're from child services." The twins' faces drained of color, and they backed toward the window. Richard could see the fear in their eyes, the instinct to run taking over. But running now would only make things worse. He had to protect them, had to keep them safe long enough to uncover the truth. But as he looked at his mother's guilty face and the twins' terrified expressions, he realized he might be facing an impossible choice: preserve his family's secrets or save these girls who had already lost so much. Richard's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The twins were already halfway to the window, their survival instincts kicking in after years on the streets. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, still clutching the photograph, while Martha waited anxiously by the door for instructions. He had mere seconds to make a decision that could change all their lives. "Martha," he said quietly but firmly, "tell them I'll be down in a moment. Girls, please trust me. Stay here with my mother." He turned to Eleanor, his voice hardening slightly. "And Mother, I think it's time you showed us that photograph." Eleanor's hands trembled as she slowly brought out the picture she'd been hiding. It showed a young woman with dark hair and striking features standing in their garden. She was wearing a maid's uniform but smiling brightly at the camera, her entire face lit up with joy. The resemblance to the twins was unmistakable. "That's Charlotte," Eleanor whispered. "This was taken about 13 years ago, just before—" She trailed off, unable to continue. Richard took the photograph gently from his mother's hands. "I'm going to deal with whoever's downstairs. When I come back, we're going to have the full truth. No more secrets." He looked at the twins, who had moved away from the window but still stood ready to bolt. "I promise I won't let anyone take you away. Do you trust me?" Emily and Grace exchanged one of their silent looks before Emily nodded slightly. "We'll wait," she said. "But if we hear anything wrong—" "I understand," Richard replied. He left the room, closing the door behind him, and headed downstairs to face whatever waited below. The woman from Child Services introduced herself as Ms. Patel. She was younger than Richard expected, with kind eyes but a no-nonsense attitude that suggested she'd seen too much to be easily fooled. "Mr. Harrison, we received an anonymous tip about 2 underage girls being brought to this address. Given your prominence in the community, I'm sure you understand why we need to investigate immediately." Richard invited her into his study, his mind working quickly. He needed to handle this carefully. One wrong move could separate the twins forever. "Ms. Patel, you're right. There are 2 girls here. I found them on the street yesterday, and given the cold weather, I couldn't leave them there. I was planning to contact the proper authorities today." Ms. Patel studied him carefully. "That's commendable, Mr. Harrison. However, you should have called us immediately. These situations are delicate. There could be parents looking for them, or other circumstances we need to be aware of." "Of course," Richard agreed. "But perhaps we could handle this unofficially for now. These girls have clearly been through trauma. They need stability, not another institution." "Mr. Harrison," Ms. Patel leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but there are procedures that must be followed. I need to see the girls and assess their situation." Before Richard could respond, the study door opened. Eleanor stood there, supporting herself on her cane, looking more alert and determined than she had in years. "I apologize for interrupting," she said, her voice steady, "but I believe I can help clarify the situation." Richard watched in amazement as his mother made her way to a chair, sat down carefully, and fixed Ms. Patel with a piercing gaze. "Those girls upstairs, they're my granddaughters. Their mother worked in this house years ago. Through a series of unfortunate events, we lost track of them. Finding them now feels like a miracle, one we don't want to squander." Miss Patel's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a claim, Mrs. Harrison. Do you have any documentation to support this?" "Not yet," Eleanor admitted. "But we have photographs, and the resemblance is undeniable. Give us time to prove it." "Please." The social worker was quiet for a long moment, looking between Richard and Eleanor. Finally, she spoke. "I can give you 72 hours. After that, If you can't provide documentation proving your relationship to these girls, I'll have no choice but to place them in the system. After Ms. Patel left, Richard turned to his mother. Granddaughters? Mother, what aren't you telling me? Eleanor's burst of strength seemed to leave her all at once. She sagged in her chair, suddenly looking every one of her years. It's time you knew the truth about Charlotte, about your father, about everything. Upstairs, they found the twins sitting close together on Eleanor's bed, while Martha stood guard by the door. The old photograph of Charlotte lay between them, and they had clearly been studying it intently. When Richard and Eleanor entered, they looked up with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Your mother, Eleanor began, her voice shaking slightly, was more than just an employee in this house. She paused, gathering her strength. She was involved with your father, Richard. They had a relationship that went on for months before I discovered it. Richard felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. What are you saying? I'm saying that when Charlotte discovered she was pregnant, your father panicked. We had just lost your older brother in the accident, and he was worried about the family's reputation, about what a scandal would do to the business. We made decisions that I've regretted every day since. Grace spoke up, her voice small but clear. What did you do to our mom? Eleanor's face crumpled. We forced her to leave, threatened to ruin her if she ever came back or tried to contact anyone. We used our connections to make sure she couldn't find work anywhere in the city. And when she tried to fight back, to prove her relationship with your father, Eleanor's voice broke completely. That's when you made her give us up. Emily finished, her voice hard. You forced her to put us in an orphanage. Yes, Eleanor whispered. God help me, yes. We thought we were protecting our family's reputation, but we destroyed 3 lives instead. And now, she looked at Richard, tears streaming down her face. Now you know the worst of it. These girls, they're your sisters. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at the twins, his sisters, seeing them with new eyes. The familiar features that had nagged at his memory, the gestures that seemed to echo something he knew. They were pieces of his father, reflected in these young faces. Emily stood up suddenly, her whole body rigid with emotion. If you knew who we were, why didn't you look for us? Why did you let us live on the streets? We didn't know, Richard said quickly. I swear I had no idea about any of this. And Mother, he turned to Eleanor, did you know they were out there somewhere? Eleanor shook her head miserably. I tried to find out what happened to Charlotte after she left, but she disappeared completely. I prayed she had found a way to keep her babies, to build a life somewhere else. When that hope died, the guilt nearly destroyed me. Your father never recovered either. He spent the last years of his life trying to drink away his memories. Martha, who had been silent throughout this revelation, suddenly spoke up. There's more. All eyes turned to her. Charlotte didn't just disappear. She tried to come back, one last time, about a year after the twins were born. She had proof, documents, letters, photographs, but she never made it past the front gate. Your father's security team turned her away. The next day, she was gone. Grace had been quiet through most of this, but now she reached into their worn backpack and pulled out a small, battered envelope. Mom left this at the orphanage for us. We weren't supposed to open it until we were 18, but she looked at her sister, who nodded. We opened it last year when we ran away. There were letters inside telling us everything. About this house, about our father, about what happened. That's why we came to this part of the city. We were trying to find... You were trying to find your family, Richard finished softly. The weight of this truth, of all the years of pain and separation, settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Emily's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. We don't want your money. We don't want your name. We just want to know one thing. Where is our mother now? Eleanor and Martha exchanged a look that made Richard's blood run cold. There was something else, something even worse that hadn't been revealed yet. But before anyone could speak, the sound of the doorbell echoing through the house made them all jump. Martha hurried to the window and peered out. Her face went pale. It's Ms. Patel, and she's not alone this time. Richard looked at the twins, his sisters, who had already moved closer together, ready to run. He had 72 hours to prove their connection, to protect them from being taken away. But first, he had to convince them to stay, to trust him despite everything they'd just learned about their shared past. And somewhere out there was Charlotte, their mother, whose story wasn't finished yet. The weight of all these secrets, all these years of pain, threatened to crush them all. But as he looked at Emily and Grace, he saw something in their eyes that gave him hope, a flicker of recognition, of connection, of family. The sound of Ms. Patel's knock echoed through the suddenly silent house. Richard's mind raced as he looked at the frightened faces around him. Everything had changed in the last few minutes. These weren't just two homeless girls anymore. They were his sisters, his family, and he was damned if he was going to lose them now. "Martha," he said quietly, "stall them. Tell them I'm on an important business call." He turned to the twins. "I know you have no reason to trust us after what you've just learned, but please, give me a chance to fix this." Emily and Grace exchanged one of their silent looks, years of survival instincts warring with their newfound knowledge. Finally, Emily spoke. "What's your plan?" "First, we need documentation to prove who you are." "Mother," he turned to Eleanor, who still sat pale and shaken in her chair, "where would Father have kept important papers? Hidden papers?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "His study? There's a false bottom in the bottom desk drawer. He never knew I knew about it." She gripped her cane tightly. "But Richard, there's something else you need to know about Charlotte." "Later," Richard cut her off, hearing Martha's voice downstairs greeting Miss Patel. "Grace, Emily, come with me, quickly." They slipped out of Eleanor's room and down the back stairs that the servants had once used, emerging in the kitchen. Richard led them to his father's study, a room he rarely entered since the man's death. It felt frozen in time, everything exactly as it had been left 5 years ago. The bottom drawer was locked, but Richard knew where the key was hidden, behind a loose piece of molding near the floor. His father's predictability had annoyed him in life, but now it might save them. The drawer opened with a creak, and Richard felt along the bottom until he found the catch that released the false panel. Inside were dozens of papers, photographs and letters, all neatly organized despite their secretive nature. Richard's hands trembled as he began sorting through them. Birth certificates for Emily and Grace Harrison, never filed. Letters from Charlotte to their father, begging him to acknowledge his daughters. Legal documents drawn up to provide for the twins, never executed. And photographs. So many photographs of Charlotte, some with the twins as newborns, before everything fell apart. "He kept everything," Richard whispered, the weight of this discovery hitting him hard. "He had proof all along. Why didn't he ever come for us?" Grace's voice was small, hurt. "If he had all this, because he was a coward," Emily said bitterly. "He chose his reputation over us, over Mom." Richard couldn't defend their father, not after seeing this evidence of his calculated abandonment. But there was something else in the papers that caught his eye. Bank statements showing regular payments to an account in Charlotte's name, continuing until just 2 years ago. "These payments," he said, spreading the statements out, "they stopped suddenly. Why?" Before anyone could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Harrison, I can't stall them any longer. Ms. Patel is insisting on seeing you and the girls immediately." Richard gathered the most important documents quickly. "Emily, Grace, I know this is asking a lot, but I need you to trust me one more time. Let me show Ms. Patel these papers. Let me prove you belong here." The twins looked at each other, having another of their silent conversations. Then Grace picked up one of the photographs, Charlotte holding them as newborns, and clutched it to her chest. "Okay," she said softly, "but we want to know everything. About Mom, about why those payments stopped, about all of it." "You will," Richard promised. "No more secrets." They made their way to the front room where Ms. Patel waited with her colleague. The social worker's eyes narrowed as she took in their slightly disheveled appearance, but Richard spoke before she could comment. "Ms. Patel, I have the documentation you asked for." He laid out the birth certificates and other papers carefully. "Emily and Grace Harrison, my sisters." The next hour was tense as Ms. Patel and her colleague examined every document, asked probing questions, and took detailed notes. The twins sat close together on the sofa, answering questions when asked, but otherwise remaining silent. Richard could see them fighting their instinct to run with every passing minute. Finally, Ms. Patel sat back. "These documents appear to be legitimate, though we'll need to verify them officially. However, this does raise some serious questions about why these girls were abandoned in the first place and why no one looked for them all these years." "I can explain." Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. She stood there leaning heavily on her cane, looking frail but determined. "But first, there's something else you all need to know about Charlotte, about why those payments stopped." Richard felt his heart skip a beat at his mother's tone. The twins straightened, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Eleanor made her way slowly to a chair, every step seeming to cost her tremendous effort. "2 years ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I received a letter from Charlotte's lawyer. She was very sick. Cancer. She used the last of her strength to write letters for the girls, to try one last time to find them. But," Eleanor's voice broke, "by the time the letter reached me, she was gone." The sound Grace made was barely human, a keening cry of pain quickly muffled as Emily wrapped her arms around her sister. Richard felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Their mother had died, still searching for them, never knowing her daughters had ended up on the streets. "The payments stopped because there was no one left to send them to," Eleanor continued, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to find the girls then. I hired investigators, but the trail was cold. The orphanage had closed, records were lost or sealed, and I failed them. Again." Ms. Patel's professional demeanor softened slightly as she watched the scene unfold. "Mrs. Harrison, while this explains some things, it doesn't excuse the years of abandonment these girls suffered." "No," Eleanor agreed. "Nothing can excuse what we did. But please, give us a chance to make it right. They're all I have left of Charlotte, all Richard has left of his father, their family." Emily spoke up suddenly, her voice hard despite the tears on her face. "Did she suffer at the end?" Eleanor shook her head. "Her lawyer said it was quick, once they finally discovered it. She had been too busy searching for you to take care of herself properly. When she realized she was running out of time, she wrote those letters." She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 sealed envelopes, worn as if they'd been carried for a long time. "I've been carrying these, hoping I would find you someday." The twins stared at the letters, their mother's last words to them, but made no move to take them. Richard understood. Some wounds were too fresh, some truths too painful to face immediately. Ms. Patel cleared her throat gently. "Given the documentation and circumstances, I'm willing to grant temporary custody to Mr. Harrison while we process everything officially. However," she fixed Richard with a stern look, "there will be regular checks. These girls have been through enough trauma. They need stability, counseling, and time to adjust." "They'll have everything they need," Richard promised. "Whatever it takes." After Ms. Patel and her colleague left, an uncomfortable silence fell over the house. The twins still sat close together, the letters from their mother untouched on the coffee table between them. Eleanor had retreated to her chair by the window, lost in her own thoughts and regrets. Richard stood by the fireplace, watching his newly discovered sisters and wondering how to bridge the vast gulf of pain and loss that separated them. Finally, Emily spoke. "We need time to process all this, to decide what we want." Richard nodded. "This is your home now, if you want it to be, but you can take all the time you need. No pressure, no expectations." Grace reached out slowly and picked up the letters, handling them as if they might crumble to dust. "Mom never stopped looking for us," she whispered. "Even when she was dying, she never stopped." No, she didn't, Eleanor said softly from her corner. Charlotte was the strongest person I ever knew. I realized that too late, much too late. But you girls, you have her strength. I see it in everything you do. Emily stood suddenly. We'd like to go to our room now, to read these. Her voice caught slightly on the word these, their mother's last words to them. Richard watched them go, Grace clutching the letters and Emily with her arm protectively around her sister's shoulders. When they reached the stairs, Emily turned back briefly. "Thank you," she said, "for telling us the truth, finally." After they were gone, Richard sank into a chair, emotionally exhausted. "Mother," he said quietly, "is there anything else? Any other secrets that might hurt them?" Eleanor was silent for a long moment, staring out at the gathering dusk. "Just one," she finally said, "but it's not a secret that will hurt them. It might even help them heal if I can find the courage to tell it." Before Richard could ask what she meant, a quiet sob drifted down from upstairs, one of the twins reading their mother's last words. He closed his eyes, his heart aching for his sisters and for the woman he had never known, who had loved them so fiercely until the very end. Martha appeared silently, placing a cup of tea near Eleanor and resting a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder. "Family," she said softly, "is more than blood and birth certificates. It's what you build together day by day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Richard looked up at the ceiling, thinking of his sisters reading their mother's final messages, and hoped they could find a way to build something new from the ashes of so much pain. But first, they all needed to face one final truth, the secret Eleanor still held close to her heart, whatever it was that might help his sisters heal. Dawn crept slowly over the city, painting the Harrison house in soft golden light. Richard had barely slept, spending most of the night in his father's study, reading through the documents they'd discovered. Each letter, each photograph, each piece of evidence told part of a story he was only now beginning to understand. The depth of his father's failure and his apparent regret was written in every carefully preserved piece of paper. Upstairs, he knew the twins had stayed awake as well. He had heard their quiet voices through the night, occasionally broken by muffled sobs as they read and reread their mother's final letters. He hadn't intruded on their grief, understanding they needed this time alone with the last words of the woman who had never stopped searching for them. Eleanor, too, had remained awake in her room. Several times during the night, Richard had heard her cane tapping on the floor as she paced, something she hadn't done in years. Whatever final secret she held seemed to be weighing on her heavily. As the first real rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, Martha appeared with coffee and a gentle but firm suggestion that everyone should try to eat something. One by one they gathered in the kitchen, first Richard, then the twins with their eyes red but faces composed, and finally Eleanor, looking as if she had aged years overnight. They ate in silence until Eleanor suddenly put down her toast with trembling hands. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "Something I should have told you all yesterday." The twins tensed visibly, but Richard noticed they didn't move to run. It was a small sign of trust, but significant given everything they'd been through. "Before Charlotte," Eleanor's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "Before she died, she sent me one more thing. Not just the letters for you girls, but a key to a storage unit here in the city. I went there after I got her letter. Everything she kept, everything she saved for you, it's all there." Emily's hand found Grace's under the table, squeezing tight. "You've known this all along?" Emily's voice was carefully controlled, but Richard could hear the undercurrent of anger. "I've been a coward," Eleanor admitted. "I should have told you immediately, but I was afraid. Afraid of facing everything she saved, afraid of seeing more evidence of how completely we failed her, failed all of you." Grace spoke up, her voice soft but steady. "We want to see it. Today." Richard looked at his mother. "Do you still have the key?" Eleanor nodded and slowly withdrew an old brass key from her pocket. "I've carried it every day, waiting for this moment. But there's something else you should know first." She took a deep breath. Charlotte didn't just leave mementos and photographs. She left evidence, proof of everything that happened, everything your father and I did. She wanted you to have the whole truth, not just our version of it. The storage facility was in a quiet part of Queens, a nondescript building that had probably looked exactly the same when Charlotte had rented the unit years ago. The manager recognized Eleanor immediately. "Mrs. Harrison, I remember when you came 2 years ago. You didn't stay long then." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "I wasn't ready, but they are." She gestured to the twins. The unit was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long corridor of identical rolling doors. Eleanor handed the key to Emily, who took it with slightly shaking hands. The door opened with a metallic groan, revealing a space that was smaller than Richard had expected, but meticulously organized. Boxes lined the walls, each carefully labeled in Charlotte's neat handwriting: baby clothes, school records, photos. But it was what stood in the center of the unit that caught everyone's attention. A beautiful antique desk, its surface covered with framed photographs and a large leather-bound album. "That was her mother's desk," Eleanor said softly. "She used to talk about how it was the only thing she had left of her family. I never thought—" Grace approached the desk slowly, reaching out to touch one of the framed photos. It showed Charlotte holding the twins as infants, her face radiant with joy. "She kept everything," Grace whispered. Emily was already opening boxes, her movements becoming more urgent with each new discovery. "Look at this," she said, pulling out tiny dresses. "She saved our baby clothes. And here, school uniforms from the orphanage, report cards, everything." Richard watched as his sisters explored their mother's carefully preserved archive of their lives. Each item seemed to fill in another piece of the puzzle, showing how deeply Charlotte had loved them even when she couldn't be with them. Then Emily opened a box simply labeled "Truth" and fell silent. Inside were dozens of notebooks, Charlotte's diaries, along with letters, legal documents and photographs that told the darker story of what had happened in the Harrison house. "You should read them," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with resignation. "All of it. You deserve to know everything." For the next several hours, they sat together in the storage unit, reading through Charlotte's detailed accounts of her time with their father, the pressure and threats from Eleanor, the desperate attempts to keep her daughters, and finally, the heartbreaking decision to leave them at the orphanage to protect them from the Harrisons' influence. But there was something else in Charlotte's writings, something none of them had expected. As they read through her later journals, a different story emerged, one of forgiveness and understanding. In her final years, as she battled cancer while searching for her daughters, Charlotte had found a way to let go of her anger. "I don't want my girls to inherit my pain," she had written. "If they find these words after I'm gone, I want them to know that forgiveness isn't about excusing what was done, but about freeing yourself from the weight of hatred." Eleanor and Harrison made terrible choices, but they were human choices, made out of fear and pride. My daughters deserve to live unburdened by the past. Grace's hands trembled as she read these words aloud. Emily, who had maintained her composure throughout most of their discoveries, finally broke down, sobbing quietly as her sister held her. Eleanor had been silent for a long time, but now she spoke, her voice thick with tears. "Your mother was a better person than I ever understood. She found the strength to forgive us when we least deserved it. I don't expect the same from you girls, but I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Richard, who had been reading through some of the legal documents, suddenly straightened. "There's something else here. Mother, did you know about this?" He held up a document dated just months before Charlotte's death. It was a trust fund she had set up for the twins, funded by the payments she had received from their father over the years. She had invested the money carefully, letting it grow while she searched for her daughters. "She never touched it," Richard said in amazement. "Every penny their father sent, she saved for them. This is a substantial amount of money." "We don't want it," Emily said immediately, but Grace touched her arm. "Em, look at this." She pointed to a note Charlotte had paperclipped to the trust document. She says, "It's not about the money. It's about making sure we have choices. All the choices she never had. She wants us to use it for education, for opportunities, for building the lives we want." Richard watched his sisters absorb this new information, seeing them struggle with the implications. These girls, who had survived on the streets by their wits and determination, now had the means to shape their own futures. It was overwhelming, but also incredibly empowering. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said gently. "The money will be there when you're ready, just like this place, all these memories your mother saved for you. They'll be here when you want to explore them." Emily stood up suddenly, walking to the antique desk and picking up the photo of Charlotte with them as babies. I think I understand now why she saved all this, organized it so carefully. She knew someday we'd need it, not just to know the truth, but to know her, to understand where we came from and who we are." Grace joined her sister, both of them looking at their mother's smiling face in the photograph. "She never gave up on us," Grace said softly. "Even at the end, she was thinking about our future." Eleanor struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her cane. "Girls, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider coming home? Not just staying in the house, but really making it your home. There's so much I want to learn about you, so much time to make up for." The twins looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations. Finally, Emily spoke. "We need time to process all this, to figure out who we are now that we know the truth, but..." She glanced at Grace, who nodded. "We'd like to stay, for now, to get to know our brother, and maybe to understand our family better." Richard felt something tight in his chest loosen at these words. They weren't promising forever, but they were willing to try. It was more than he had dared to hope for yesterday. Martha, who had been quietly helping organize the boxes they'd gone through, spoke up. "Why don't we bring some of these things back to the house? That desk, it should be somewhere the girls can see it every day. And these photos, they deserve to be on walls, not hidden away in storage." Over the next few hours, they carefully packed the most precious items to take home. The desk would go in the library, where the girls could visit it whenever they wanted. Photos would be framed and hung, Charlotte's presence finally acknowledged in the house where she had once worked and loved and lost so much. As they prepared to leave, Richard noticed Eleanor standing by the desk, her hand resting on its smooth surface. "I wish I had known her better," she said quietly. "I wish I had been brave enough to see past my own fear and pride. She could have been such a wonderful part of our family." "She still is," Grace said unexpectedly. "Through us, through everything she saved here, through the love she never stopped feeling, even when it hurt." Emily nodded, adding, "And maybe that's what family really is. Not just the people who share our blood or our name, but the ones who never stop loving us, never stop believing in us, even when they're gone." As they drove home in the fading light of evening, Richard looked in the rearview mirror at his sisters in the back seat. They were each holding one of Charlotte's journals, their free hands clasped together as always. They had a long road ahead, trust to build, wounds to heal, a future to shape, but they had something they hadn't had yesterday: truth, understanding, and the knowledge that their mother's love had been constant and unwavering. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, clutching a small framed photo of Charlotte that she had asked to keep. "We'll do better this time," she whispered, so quietly Richard almost missed it. For Charlotte, for all of us. The house looked different somehow when they pulled up, as if the truth they'd uncovered had physically transformed it. Martha had left lights on in every window, making it glow warmly in the gathering dusk. As they carried boxes and treasured items inside, Richard realized that's what had changed. It no longer felt like a house preserved in past regrets and secrets. It felt finally like a home where healing could begin.